So I guess at this point we will just start our Sunday school lesson. Um, now, let me see first if I can get my slides going here. Am I set to share, Nicholas?
Yep, you should be able to.
Okay. All right. Did that come up?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. Well, let's just start with a little bit of background for those who are not normally in this class. We've been looking at the Philistines for the past 3 or 4 weeks, and um, we just a quick recap. This really should be the last week talking about the Philistines, and then we'll move into talking about the giants next week. But just as a very quick recap, we saw that the Philistines were descended from Ham through two grandchildren. There was one named Caphtor, and then there were also the Casluhites. And those two brothers, um, their descendants moved to the island of Crete, and then through a series of natural disasters and wars with Egypt, these people from Caphtor or Crete um, became the Philistines. They were driven to and settled along the southeast coast of Israel. Um, but there were two sets of Philistines, or people called Philistines anyway. There were those before the Exodus and those after the Exodus, because Abraham and Isaac had interaction with some people called the Philistines, but they were actually probably really a group of people called the Avites. Um, and then the Philistines from Caphtor came in and displaced the Avites and became the Philistines that we are more familiar with. And people in that territory just, the Avites at the time of Abraham and Isaac were called Philistines probably because that's the people that everyone would have been familiar with. And so people end up getting called their territory is. And we'll actually talk about that some more today. And what things and who is who today later in the class. Um, there's a reference, and I don't have it up on the screen, but there's a reference in Amos 9:7. God says, "Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?" And that all happened at about the same time. At the time of the Exodus, or very just shortly before the Exodus, the Philistines were in the land, but just barely before. And the Arameans, or the Syrians, came from a land farther east and were settled in modern day Syria. Again, all at about the same time. And God phrases this in a way in Amos that makes it sound like it is all kind of the same sort of movement. And I think it's an interesting question to ask. Why is that? Why did God cause the Philistines? Why did he bring the Philistines through natural disasters and wars to the Philistine territory along the coast of Israel at just about the same time as he brought the Israels up, as he brought the Hebrews up out of Egypt, and also at just about the same time he brought Syrians over from where they had been to where they ended up. Why did he do that? Um, and and then when he brought the Hebrews up out of Egypt, we're told a very interesting passage in Exodus 13:7. It says he didn't lead them straight up along the coast. To go from Egypt to Israel would be a very straightforward thing today, where you go straight up along the Mediterranean Sea. But he didn't do that because he didn't want them to confront the Philistines right away. And that's the first people they would have run across. And he says, because if they see war, they might turn and go back to Egypt. So that was another question. Why? Why is that? Because 2 years later, he says, go. And the spies bring back a mixed report, and the people are afraid to go then. And 40 years later, almost the same things happens. They are afraid, but they do go. And another point is that we talked about is that the several times that God promises to Abraham the land, he lists 10 nations that Israel would displace. The Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites, so on and so forth. Never does it say, and the Philistines. Never does it say the Philistines will be displaced and moved along or destroyed, and you will take over their land. But, and so that's another question. Why is that? Why is that? And then, and yet the tribes, when the tribes were allotted their territories, the Philistine territory was allotted to Judah and to Dan. Well, Judah was a big tribe. They never conquered the Philistines. Judah was a big tribe, but so they were able to just kind of stay to the east of the Philistine territory. Dan was a little tribe, and they ended up getting run off. There's a reference that says that the Philistines and the Amorites, they could never conquer them, so they moved. The whole tribe of Dan picked up and moved north. And we're familiar with the phrase from Dan to Beersheba. Well, Dan was at the far north of the territory of Israel because they could never conquer their territory that had been allotted. Again, why? There's a long history of conflict between Israel and the Philistines. In our minds, maybe they do in mine, the Philistines play a large role in the book of Judges. But really, only the judge Ehud, who gets one verse in the whole book, he and Samson are the only two judges who really had interaction with the Philistines. As a side note, we talked a lot about Samson last week. You ever notice, did it ever occur to you that Samson, as far as we know, never encountered a giant? Again, just something to think about that, and maybe we'll see why as we start talking about the giants here in the next few weeks. Even David couldn't defeat the Philistines. And if David didn't do it, couldn't do it, who could? And we saw that there was battle after battle after battle after battle with the Philistines. And David confronted giants, not just Goliath, but we'll talk about that over the next few weeks. Um, and excuse me, finally, last week we saw that the story isn't all black and white. And always in the Bible, if we have these black and white two-dimensional perspectives, um, we do those stories a disservice and we do ourselves a disservice. The Bible is written in a black and white kind of way, and it's easy for us to not make it three-dimensional or to miss the three dimensions that are sometimes presented. And there is one case here on the screen. There was this group of people called the Gittites. Well, the Gittites were people from Gath. And there were, when David escaped Jerusalem to escape from the clutches of Absalom, 600 Gittites went with him. Well, where did those Gittites come from? They came from the time that David was with King Achish of Gath, and he spent a year as one of his generals, a dark period in David's life. These Gittites saw something in David. These men from Gath and these 600 men from Gath aligned themselves with David and came back to Israel with him. And there were also two groups called the Pelethites and the Kerethites, and they were David's bodyguards. They too, there's really not as much known about them, but they too were from Philistia. So these three groups, the Gittites, the Pelethites, and the Kerethites, were people who saw something in David, saw something in the God of Israel, and aligned themselves with David. And we see then that when David made the mistake with the ark, carrying it on the ox cart, and he had to stop, he gave the ark to Obed-Edom, the Gittite. And God blessed Obed-Edom. So again, David saw something in this man. So there are exceptions to the Philistine story. But for the most part, we're picking up fresh here now today. For the most part, we see a pattern of wars and battles, and the Philistines never quite being eliminated as an enemy. The Philistines were strong. We talked about this some last week. Why were the Philistines so strong and so able to fend off the Israelites? Well, they had this territory along the coast. It was 5 Philistine cities of Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. And that was a very fertile land. And so they had a very healthy piece of property, and they had a strong army, and they had money because they controlled the coast and shipping, and they had this fertile land, and so they were able to pay their army, and so their strong army was able to defend all of this. And they controlled the coast, and they controlled the trade routes, the road that went between Egypt and Syria. So even David, he defeated them repeatedly in battle, but he never destroyed them. And I want to open this up to discussion later, and I'm hoping we can make that work. But I'm going to just read the references that come up on the screen for the sake of uh, clarity. If I can make that next screen happen here, why can't I make that happen? Let's see. Oh, here we go. Finally. Okay. Oops, that went a little too far, but that's okay. So First Chronicles 18:1. We're going to take a little walk through time here. If you look at the chronology on the right, that's just sort of a broad. We talked a lot about time dates as well, dates and archaeology. They're really at best a reference point because there's a lot of disagreement over dates. And archaeology often doesn't fit the dates that we think. The archaeologists will give one set of dates and they don't match what we think are the dates from the Bible, and it gets confusing. So we kind of have to ignore dates, but I've just put them over here on the right as one set of dates as sort of a guideline for how long the Philistines were a problem. So this is David, and that's about 1050 BC. Back that up to the time of the judges, another 300 or 400 years before the time of Joshua. So go back to about maybe 1450 BC to now. Here we have 1050 BC, the time of David. It says, in the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Gath and its surrounding villages from the control of the Philistines. And I think when we see something like this, we have to ask ourselves, where were the Gittites? Where were the Pelethites and the Kerethites in this time? Where were the Gittites who were from Gath when David defeated the Philistines and took Gath? We don't know. We don't know. That's hard to imagine that they involved themselves in that battle. Maybe they were given a reprieve and didn't participate in that. But it was over and over again. David, we see verses like this over the course of David's life, where David had a battle and defeated the Philistines. And when we think defeat, we think, okay, that's it for them. But it wasn't true, ever. We get to the time of Solomon. Solomon, who had peace. And it says, and Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. But they were his subjects. They weren't destroyed. They weren't driven out. And then, sorry that this is a long one, but it's an interesting one, I think. We get to Asa, who was Solomon's great grandson. So maybe 100 or so years later. And here the Philistines are a little bit buried in the narrative because it's really talking about a battle with the Cushites, who are the Ethiopians. Zerah the Cushite marched out against them being Judah, with an army of thousands upon thousands and 300 chariots. I think the King James says a million, an army of a million, 300 chariots, and came as far as Marishah. Asa went out to meet him, and they took up battle positions in the valley of Zephathah near Marishah. Then Asa called to the Lord his God and said, Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. Help us, Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this vast army. Lord, you are our God. Do not let mere mortals prevail against you. The Lord struck down the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The Cushites fled, and Asa and his army pursued them as far as Gerar. Such a great number of Cushites fell that they could not recover. They were crushed before the Lord and his forces. The men of Judah carried off a large amount of plunder. They destroyed all the villages around Gerar, for the terror of the Lord had fallen on them. They looted all these villages, since there was much plunder there. They also attacked the camps of the herdsmen and carried off droves of sheep and goats and camels. Then they returned to Jerusalem. Okay, so the Cushites come as far as Marishah, which is maybe about 20 miles or so southeast. I'm sorry, it would be southwest of Jerusalem. And God helps Israel drive them as far as Gerar. Well, Gerar really isn't that far. Do you recognize the name Gerar? Gerar is the little town where Abimelech, king of the Philistines at the time of Abraham and Isaac, lived. Gerar never really factors in to the Philistines after that time. Rather, we have the five larger towns of Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath. But it's hidden here, and we can miss it. So it's interesting. While this is really about the Cushites, it looks like Asa and Judah attacked and plundered Gerar and all the villages around Gerar while they were destroying or driving away the Cushites. All right, so then when Joash was king, another maybe 75 years later, about this time, Hazael, king of Aram is Syria. King James says Syria, everybody else says Aram, went up and attacked Gath and captured it. Then he turned to attack Jerusalem. And we know he wasn't successful in that, but he did attack and capture Gath. And archaeologists have found siege works around Gath, presumably from this time, suggesting that it underwent a protracted conflict. Then, about 25 years later, we come to the time of King Uzziah. And we're told he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Amaziah had done. He sought God during the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God. As long as he sought the Lord, God gave him success. He went to war against the Philistines and broke down the walls of Gath, Jabneh, and Ashdod. He then rebuilt towns near Ashdod and elsewhere among the Philistines. God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabs who lived in Gurbaal and against the Maonites. Again, another king, another 75 years later, 25 years later, whatever. And there's war and success against the Philistines, but not destruction. Finally, then we get, well, not really finally, but we come to the time of Hezekiah. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands the Lord had given Moses, and the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory. But the Philistines are always there. They're always there to be defeated, never destroyed. We have to ask ourselves, why is that? They continue to appear throughout the major and minor prophets. We already talked about them in Amos, where God says, didn't I bring them from Caphtor? And we'll get to another reference that's clearly a prophecy of the last days. Working more from history now, at the time that Assyria took Israel captive in 721 BC, the northern 10 tribes, when Assyria took them captive in 721 BC, Assyria also conquered the Philistines, but allowed the kings of the 5 cities to remain as vassals. And Egypt kept instigating rebellions against Assyria, inciting its neighbors to rebel. And that resulted in Ashkelon and Ekron and Judah and Sidon revolting against Sennacherib. And Sennacherib squashed the revolt, and he defeated the Egyptians, and he destroyed a lot of the areas around there, including Philistia, and he forced them to pay tribute. Didn't destroy them, just forced them to pay tribute. Then, 604 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar laid the remaining Philistine cities to waste. He destroyed them, and he sent the Philistines into exile into Mesopotamia, along with the conquered Judeans. And there are 6th century BC cuneiform tablets that have been unearthed near Babylon in modern day Iraq that describe people as men of Gaza or men of Ashkelon. And this suggests that the Philistines may have lived near the city and perhaps preserved their identity to some extent for a century or more. But their descendants never returned to Philistia, and they assimilated into Babylon's local population. So unlike Israel, Judah, that returned from exile, the Philistines never did. However, it appears that just like with Israel and Judah, a remnant was left behind. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, they would leave the poorest of the people back in the land to keep the land from just going wild. And so Philistines were still referred to even later. Nehemiah, when the people of Judah are coming back to Jerusalem, Nehemiah tells us that the people of Ashdod, along with the Arabs and the Ammonites, were angry about the walls of Jerusalem being repaired. And he also tells us that the men of Judah intermarried with and had children by the women of Ashdod. The Philistines are referred to in the Maccabees. The time of the Maccabees was the 2nd century BC. So now this is 300-400 years later, still later. And they are mentioned by name in First Maccabees. And then, finally, the last time they're mentioned, sort of mentioned, just is, remember, Jesus is maligned when I believe it was the Pharisees who said that Jesus casts out demons by Beelzebub, the god, prince of demons. Well, Beelzebub was the god of Ekron, one of the Philistine cities. So what's this god still doing around? Good question. The god is mentioned elsewhere in the story about Ahaziah and Elijah. That's the one other time we see Beelzebub. Beelzebub was Lord of the Flies, and the Jews converted that to Bull. So it's Beelzebul, which is the Lord of Dung, to associate this demon with anything filthy, including unclean spirits. But the Philistines themselves, at the time of Jesus, there's no mention of the Philistines. And they had, by that time, and the remnant that were left behind 600 years earlier by the Nebuchadnezzar, they were just completely assimilated by the various peoples, including the Romans, that were living along the southern coast of Israel at that time. Well, what about today? Are the Palestinians today the Philistines? Psalm 83 is generally considered to be about today. And who are each of these nations? O God, do not remain silent. Do not turn a deaf ear. Do not stand aloof, O God. See how your enemies growl, how your foes rear their heads. With cunning they conspire against your plot against those you cherish. Come, they say, let us destroy them as a nation, so that Israel's name is remembered no more. With one mind they plot together. They form an alliance against you. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagrites, Byblos, Ammon and Amalek, Philistia, with the people of Tyre. Even Assyria has joined them to reinforce Lot's descendants. So there is where those 10 nations, always 10, right? This is where those 10 nations are or were. This is a map of today, but with those nations put over top of them. And those nations don't really exist today. The city of Tyre being the one exception to that. They're called something else today. So Philistia is mentioned, and we've got the Palestinians kind of there. Now, before we get back to looking at who is where, we've also got the question of words. Are the Philistines the Palestinians? Well, this is where words come from. You see Philistine. That's the word in Hebrew that's translated as Philistine. And that word Philistine comes from another word, Peleshet, which means migratory or land of sojourners. Well, in English, we also look now at the right-hand side. You see down there in English, we've got the word Palestine, which comes from the Greek word Palestine, which also comes from that same word, Hebrew word, Peleshet. So there is a linguistic relationship between the word Philistine and the word Palestine. And that word Peleshet may come from another word, palash, meaning to roll in the dust. But Peleshet, anyway, migratory, land of sojourners. The Philistines were the Caphtorites that came from Crete. So that definitely would apply to them. So are the Palestinians the Philistines? We've got this word association, if that means anything. And if we look at the map, we see the 5 cities. Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza are current cities today. Gath and Ekron are not current cities, but those are their locations. You can see, and you can see then down there that dotted line a little farther south. That dotted line is the Gaza Strip. That tiny little area. And so the cities of the Philistines don't correlate with the current Palestinian territory. Ekron is practically Tel Aviv. But does that matter? The map doesn't quite line up, but does that matter? And also, we know that genetically, they're not the same people. Um, the Philistines, as a genetic, you can't trace anybody back to them anymore. The Palestinians are not the genetic, uh, from the same genetic line as the Philistines. Um, so, and well, I want to look at one more reference. Zechariah says this: Ashkelon will see it. And this is clearly a last days prophecy. Ashkelon will see it. What is it? They're going to see that, in earlier verses, the destruction of Syria and Lebanon. Gaza will writhe in agony. Ekron, too, for her hope will wither. Gaza will lose her king, and Ashkelon will be deserted. A mongrel people, or foreign, illegitimate, other translations say, will mongrel people will occupy Ashdod, and I will put an end to the pride of the Philistines. I will take the blood from their mouths, the forbidden food from between their teeth. Those who are left will belong to our God and become a clan in Judah, and Ekron will be like the Jebusites. But I will encamp at my temple to guard it against marauding forces. Never again will an oppressor overrun my people, for now I am keeping watch. So these cities, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashdod, are all very specifically in this last days prophecy. And you'll notice down there it says they will become, those who are left will become a clan in Judah. I think that really says something to us, that whoever these people from Ashkelon, Gaza, these Philistine cities, whoever they are, will become a clan in Judah. That's a blessing. And Ekron will be like the Jebusites. Now, I wonder if anybody has any thoughts on that, because remember, the Jebusites were the people who occupied Jerusalem, who David drove out. They were one of the 10 nations that were promised to Abraham to be destroyed. Anybody have any thoughts on what it means that these people from these Philistine cities will be like the Jebusites? But also those who are left will become a clan in Judah. Any thoughts on any of that?
Doesn't seem to be the opposite of what's going on with the feet of um, iron and clay, right? Where they won't mix. There seems to be a mixing here and a coming together that's different than the image of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah. You mean that they will become like a clan in Judah?
Right, right.
Uh-huh. Yeah. You know, I read this and my immediate thought is Ekron will be like the Jebusites. Whenever I see that, I think whenever we see that phrase will be like in the Bible, it always has something to do with destruction. Um, Something negative. It's got a negative connotation. But I think maybe here it doesn't. I think, the Bible repeats itself too. In the Psalms, it'll say something one way and then it'll say the same thing another way in the same verse. And I think it's doing that here. Ekron will be like the Jebusites. Who else was a Jebusite? Becky's sitting here saying a lot of people.
Aruna, he was the one that
Anybody?
David,
Excuse me?
Aruna the Jebusite, who was the one that David came and
Aruna. Yeah. Who was Aruna?
he had a threshing floor that David made sacrifices to so that the curse that God placed upon Israel ended and the angel of death was stopped.
Right. Yeah. And Aruna said, no, no, take the land here, take the oxen. And David said, no, I'm going to buy it from you. And then that's where the temple ended up being built.
Was it
Um,
Melchizedek?
was Melchizedek a Jebusite? Huh.
It
That's a
wasn't called
really
Jebus
interesting.
then, but it's the same place.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You know, it never says that Melchizedek was a Jebusite, but he was king of Salem. And that would have been, yeah, it makes perfect sense that actually he was a Jebusite. That's that's a really interesting point.
I
Um,
pasted a link to a genetic research paper from the DNA from teeth of people in Ashkelon that was done between 2016 and 2020, which you might find fun chewing on, pardon the pun, later. But it's got a lot of information. There's even some DNA from, I think it's looks like Iceland, but it's chock
really?
full of interesting DNA markers.
Huh. Yeah, thanks. That's really that is interesting. Um, so so that yeah, I think there's this mixing going on. There's like the Gittites from Gad. The Jebusites, again, we cannot make things black and white and two-dimensional. There were good people everywhere. You know, we just finished a study of Ruth the Moabite. And here, maybe these people from Ekron will be like the Jebusites, and that's a good thing. Um, you know, Jebus also is the current day Palestinian name for Jerusalem. They don't the Palestinians don't call Jerusalem Jerusalem. They call it Jebus. Um, and you know it's like that's the equal name for Jerusalem. Are they is does that mean anything? Like there's somehow they are equals. I don't know about that. Um, but in any case, I think this is a prophecy about these the modern day Philistines, whoever they are, they will be like a clan in Judah.
Hey, look, Casey, this is Walter with a comment. Um, as we were growing up, 60, 70 days, all that kind of stuff, the Palestinians were always in the news and things. And one of the interesting things they talk about was that the Palestinians were mostly populated by refugees from other places in the Arab world. Particularly, they were driven out of Jordan because they were, quote unquote, the most undesirable people to have. So I don't know how that may bear on the things, but that's how we always thought about the Palestinians as being refugees who just took over the place and settled there.
Yeah, well, maybe that fits in with that part of that verse. A mongrel people will occupy Ashdod. Um, that these, the Avites at the time of Abraham and Isaac were called Philistines. They weren't Philistines, but that's what they were called because that was their territory. Back in Psalm 83, all of those people don't exist today. Edom, Ishmael, Moab, Hagrites, Byblos, Ammon, Amalek. Well, the people of Tyre, yeah, okay, they exist, but 9 out of the 10 don't exist today. But this is where they were. And so in that psalm, it's talking about those territories and the people, whatever they're called today, those territories surrounding Israel. And so Philistia makes perfect sense to me that that's the Palestinians today. Anybody have any other thoughts on that?
So again, Casey, it's worth noting your Moab, your Edom, your Ammon, most of those are places like Jordan. And once again, that migration from that area were those named places. And it gives good credence that the rejects from these regions very well could be what we think of as the Palestinians today. And maybe you can call them whatever name you want.
Yeah, right.
Casey,
Huh?
just something I'd heard in the past. The Palestinians refer to Jerusalem as Jebus, primarily in an effort to show that we have claim prior to the reign of King David. It's of course they have to associate themselves to the Jebusites, but it's the way of saying no, we were here first.
That's true. That's true. And isn't it interesting that God set this up? He brought the Philistines at just about the same time that he brought the Syrians to Syria from Kir, which is probably over somewhere around Baghdad today. And he brought the Israelites from Egypt, all at just about the same time. And so this claim to the land, that's an interesting point you make about
Casey,
Mm-hmm.
there's a similar point to be made about the name of Palestine itself, because in I think it's 135, Hadrian, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, he renamed Judea Philistina as an insult to the Jews, as a way of trying to completely wipe Jewish existence identity off the map. So that's another part of, like, when you were talking about like the origins of the word, but there's also this whole historical aspect of how it was brought into use by Hadrian.
Oh yeah. Thanks. Like, I need to look into that some more. Okay, we are running out of time, but there's one last point I want to look at, and I want to ask the question, why? God doesn't do things for no reason. Why were the Philistines there? Why were they never driven out? Why were they not in the list of 10 nations, although Judah and Dan were given their territory? Why were the Philistines a thorn in Israel's side for hundreds and hundreds of years? There's a verse in Judges that we should look at. These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience. The 5 rulers of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites living in the Lebanon mountains from Mount Baal Hermon to Lebo Hamath, they were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey God's commands, which he had given their ancestors through Moses. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. So I read this and I think, that God left them there, ensured that they would be there, never were they defeated, only to teach warfare. Which and then down below, while it says only to teach warfare, it also says to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands, which had a lot to do with intermarriage. And so, is there a correlation between teaching warfare and obeying God? Think about the whole armor of God. I just want to open this up to discussion. Any thoughts anybody has on this topic?
Casey? Just now.
I'm sorry, who is that? Somebody saying something?
Yeah, Casey, this is Ron Dietrich. I just got a question. That's a great point that you make. I'm wondering how God does that today in our lives. Does he keep people, in our lives like the Philistines to test us as well?
Yeah. That's something we were going to save until after we talk about the giants,
Okay.
because that factors in even more clearly. And I think that is really exactly the point of all of this for us today. There are Philistines and there are giants. And the Philistines are always there to needle us. Our life isn't easy. To test us.
So Casey, I find it interesting. It says only to teach warfare, which just means to take and conquer and do what God originally told them to do, that they would fulfill that commands. And then, of course, the test was to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands. So it seems like the whole point is, will you obey my commands? I teach you how to do warfare so you can drive out these people over and over through time. Yet we see in the last part of the verses, they didn't. They just took the easy road and intermarried, and forgot about needing to do battle with them. And so that's the warning to us today about this embracing other things other than the truth.
Casey, God always provides contrast, night and day, and this is a contrast, to give us a choice as to who are we going to serve? Are we going to do what's visible and maybe what seems right, or are we going to obey God? So I think this is a constant contrast for Israel and for us.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think I have come to the same conclusions about this, that the Philistines are, again, we're going to see this even more clearly when we talk about giants. The scary, scary giants. But the Philistines were always there. And we've got those people, we've got those things in our lives that are always there, that can't be defeated, or that can't be destroyed. They can be defeated, but they can't be destroyed. Repeatedly defeated. But they're always going to be there to test us, to teach us warfare. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, Casey.
Mm-hmm.
The point of warfare was to learn reliance on God. that they weren't supposed to rely on their own arms, their own strength. And therefore, if they were going to learn warfare, they were supposed to learn that they were to rely on God.
Right. The whole armor of God. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, next week we are going to move into talking about the giants, and I think that's going to be a really interesting discussion. So for today, we will close, and we'll have a prayer for others. And David Stanley, could I ask you to give that prayer?
Absolutely.